Okay, so last time we talked about the shift from the age of affect, where emotion is the paramount quality, to the age of reason, and this renewed emphasis on humanism, man as measure of the universe, man's intellect, his reason as the point of everything, the paramount feature. Oh yeah, question, Jared?
No.
Okay. So we're in that mindset. We're shifting mindsets from age of affect to age of reason in the late Baroque. And in the late Baroque, we kind of split off into those two parallel but diametrically opposed aesthetics of the Rococo and the Galant. So we actually ended in kind of a neat place last time because we talked about the Galant in Germany with J.S. Bach and Les Goûts Réunis, the Tastes Reunited. And today we're going to pick up with his contemporary, George Frederick Handel. Now, before we launch into Handel, I want to reiterate my problems with the great man narrative. Remember, we are not holding Handel up, or Bach for that matter. We're not holding them up as being separate from their times. We are holding them up as being representative of their times. These guys just happened to be really perfect examples of the philosophy, the artistic and aesthetic values that dominated their time. So that's why we hold up these particular individuals as opposed to, oh yeah, question?
Oh no, I just got on.
Okay. And that's why we hold up these particular individuals as opposed to any of the other working contemporaries who didn't enter the canon in such a prominent way. So those disclaimers being made, let's actually take a look at who Handel was and the environment he was working in. Well, the reason that Handel becomes such a part of the canon is because of his place at court. So how did he get this place at court? What was going on? Well, first of all, we have this guy in England come into power, George the First. And as you can see, in 1660, by the time of his birth, we're already well past the English, the what am I looking for? The height of powers of the House of Stuart. So remember the Glorious Revolution, where there's this big kerfuffle in the House of Stuart, and William and Mary of Orange actually take over power from Mary's father, James II. And there's this kind of fizzling out of the House of Stuart. So what happens when we no longer have the House of Stuart? Well, we have to look to cousins. And one of those cousins happens to be George, the elector of Hanover. So, and Hanover is one of those German principalities. It's remember, Germany doesn't exist yet. So Germany consists of these several independent principalities that are ruled by the graves, if you will, the burgraves, the margraves, the landgraves, and electors. And George the First happens to be the elector of one of those principalities called Hanover. Because he's a cousin of those Stuarts who are fizzling out, he becomes King of England in 1714. Now, he brings with him, of course, this whole sphere of influence of Germanic culture. And that German culture actually still dominates the English royal court today. If you look at Queen Elizabeth II, even her accent has very Germanic influences. It's fun to parse linguistically how Germany has crossed over, and England has been subconsciously defined by German culture. Along with all of his culture, the specific artist that George the First brings with him is this guy, Georg Friedrich Handel, who in England becomes George Frederick Handel. And the reason that George the First brings him over, and the reason that George is so attached to George, is that Handel is the non-pareil composer of Italian opera seria. So again, notice these cross-cultural influences going on. The Germans are fascinated with Italian opera seria. Now, before George I of England, the English didn't give a hoot about Italian opera seria. They didn't care what the Italians were doing. But because George I was a German and the Germans liked Italian opera seria, Handel comes over and kind of gets the English to care about opera seria for just a smidge. So let's first talk about, we were talking about instrumental music on Monday. So let's first give a hint to the instrumental music of Handel before we dive in to this operatic stuff. So Handel, as a member of the court, would have been expected to provide music for all of these important ceremonies, all of the official court proceedings that we've seen since the time of the troubadours and trouvères. Remember, as early as the Middle Ages, court musicians' jobs were to pay tribute to their royal patrons. So Handel is just continuing that centuries-long tradition and fulfilling the functional role of a court musician. So one example, and one of the earlier examples that we have, notice this is just a few years after George I takes over. So he becomes king in 1714. In 1717, Handel composes his water music. So this is an orchestral suite, and it is called Handel's water music because it was specifically meant to be performed on a barge that floated next to the king's barge as it progressed down the River Thames. Now, the Thames is the river that London is built on, so it kind of defines London topography. So what the king's barge would do is cruise down this river, and not only was it entertainment for the king, it was entertainment for all of the citizens who would come out and, oh, look at what the king's doing. Oh, isn't that fancy? It's like watching a parade. So Handel's composing music for this kind of aquatic parade, if you will. And there it actually calls for 50 musicians. So for this time and place, that's a lot of people. What piece of music have we talked about thus far that called for 50 musicians? I'm not being sarcastic when I ask that. I'm truly blanking on anything we've talked about that requires this many people.
Would like the Concerto Grosso require that many?
We could perform it with that many today, but if we look at the scores of the Concerti Grossi, we see, that concertino, which would just be 3 or 4 people, and the ripieno, the large group, would probably just be 15 to 20 tops, because you're playing with one person on a part for the most part. Sometimes if composers wanted to get fancy, they could split a line into 2, maybe 3. But for the most part, they're just performing one on a part. So even those Concerti Grossi, which is a really good thought, that's where I would go first if I wanted to look for large forces. Even those Concerti Grossi probably wouldn't involve 50. But the magnitude of this water music is, I have no word for it other than, not only in terms of performing forces, but sheer length. It is huge. We could divide the entire piece, we can divide all of water music into 3 or 4 separate partitas, 3 or 4 separate suites. And often that's what you will hear performed. Somebody will perform a suite from Handel's water music where you're just combining a few of the dances, but the water music as a whole is the length of 3 or 4 different dance suites. So that's where Handel starting in England, and it only gets bigger from there. We also have the Dettingen Te Deum from a few decades later, so we've progressed. And what this is a matins hymn. Does anybody remember what matins are? Anyone? I know we've heard that word before. We've talked about matins. Many of you recalled it on your midterm. Okay, refresher. Matins is one of those 8 daily offices that, you know, we require the psalm setting and all of that fun stuff, the antiphons, right? So matins is one of those daily offices, and Handel composed this hymn to be part of that particular office. Now, what it celebrates is victory over the French. England and France do not like each other. Even today, there's a lot of cultural tension. For as much cultural exchange as there is between England and France, think of the 100 Years' War. For as much cultural exchange as there is, there's there always seem to be picking at each other. And the 1700s were no different. So this celebrate is a hymn of thanks, celebrating victory over the French. They're basically singing, thank you, God, for helping us beat the French. And at this point in Handel's career, his music starts to take on these nationalist associations that we still maintain with Handel's music. Even though Handel was born and raised German, he gets held up in music history. We hold him up as the English composer par excellence, as the most English of all composers, if you will. And it is right around the time of this Te Deum that starts to happen. Just a few years after that, we have music for the Royal Fireworks. Again, this celebrates another victory, this time in the War of Austrian Succession. So notice all of those alliances, all of that web of familial ties all over Europe. You know, the funny thing about Europe, it's really just one family ruling everything at this point. And when I say this point, I mean the, you know, late Renaissance, early Middle Ages. Late Renaissance, early Baroque, what am I saying? So the point being, England is entangled in a larger web of European politics. And because Handel is the English composer par excellence, he is expected to contribute to that celebration, if you will. And what's really cool about music for the Royal Fireworks is that it is meant for military band. Now, military band, that's everybody's high school marching band that they grew up with, right? If you've seen a marching band, that is what military band is. But that was a new and distinct instrumentation in this time. Most serious composers did not write music for military band because military bands weren't where art happened. They were just meant to play you into battle. They're literally the whole point of a fife and drum was just to keep everyone marching at the same speed. But Handel takes that fife and drum, if you will, and turns it into this kind of high art in music for the Royal Fireworks. And it is a piece of program music. Remember, program music is music with text associated. So it's music with extra musical associations. Okay. Does everyone feel good about these ceremonial pieces of Handel's at the English court? Good. I see a few thumbs. Any questions? No questions? Okay. Then let's go ahead and move on to Handel's operas. There we go. Ta-da. So, oh, cooperate with me, thank you. As I said, Handel is strongly under the Italian influence. He's imitating a lot of what's going on in the Italian style. So he studies at the University of Halle. That's another one of those principalities. So again, not Germany, but just independent states. And then performed at the Gansemarkt in Hamburg, Germany. So what, does anybody know what the Gansemarkt is? Okay, what it is the first public opera house in all of Germany. Remember in Venice, we said that public opera becomes a thing. Opera started out as that courtly art that a rich noble had to pay for. Then in Venice, we start to see this business model where anyone with enough money could just purchase a ticket to an opera house, and the impresario would schedule whatever you needed to schedule. So that model, that business model, public opera houses, gets imported specifically to Hamburg. And there's this place called the Gansemarkt. Any of my vocal people know enough German to translate Gansemarkt? Anybody know what Gansemarkt literally means? Okay, fine. I'm sharing this just because I find it infinitely amusing. It literally means goose market. Why would they set up an opera in the goose market? Well, because it was the place with enough room to fit all of those people in. So they would literally just have the performers crammed at one end of this big open market space, and all of the audience members would shuffle into the other end of the big open marketplace, and that's where they could fit public opera. So, by the way, this is still standing, by the way. The Gansemarkt is still there. And in fact, this is it. You can see it in the picture. This is the Gansemarkt. So Handel begins his career in Halle and Hamburg as a violinist. So he's coming up through the ranks as a performer. While he is performing, he is exposed to and studying the works of Italian composers. And in fact, he even spends some time in Rome learning from the masters there. Of course, we have Arcangelo Corelli, and remember, Corelli was known for violin music, so of course this is going to attract Handel, the violinist. Corelli was big on those trio sonatas, and he was fundamental to the modern orchestra as conductor and composer. There's also Alessandro Scarlatti, who was Sicilian but worked in Rome. He was huge on the opera seria style. He wrote 115 operas. He also wrote 600 cantatas. But most importantly, what Alessandro Scarlatti did was pioneer the da capo aria form. Somebody remind me what a da capo aria is. Oh, I know y'all know this one. You can't get out of this.
It's when you take it from the head.
From the head, good. So what form does that give us? If I start something and then I go back to the head, what form is it?
ABA.
Precisely. Thank you, Mark. So it's that ABA form where I go back to the head. And we can thank Alessandro Scarlatti for standardizing that form. In addition to Alessandro Scarlatti, we have his son, also Italian overture form, which is a precursor of sonata allegro form. You do not need to know what Italian overture form is yet, but that should tickle your brain at some point when we talk about sonata allegro form. I want you to keep this in your head for when we pick up in music history 2 with sonata allegro form. But okay, Alessandro's son, Domenico, is equally important. So he's working all in pretty much every major city in Italy, as well as Spain and Portugal. Now, in contrast to Alessandro, who focused on opera and vocal music, Domenico focused on keyboard music. In fact, he composed 555 sonatas. And Domenico Scarlatti was known for his technical ability. So whereas Alessandro Scarlatti influences Handel's taste in form, Domenico Scarlatti influences Handel's demand for virtuosity. We are going to see Handel incorporate this virtuosic taste. He's going to make demands of his performers that Domenico Scarlatti pioneered. So a perfect example of Handel incorporating this Italian opera style is a very early opera of Handel's, Agrippina. I had to put Joyce DiDonato on here because, of course, she graduated from Wichita State University. So your very own, not classmate, your very own. Well, anyway, she's cool. The point being, this is one of the earliest examples of Handel's use of this Italian form. So already in 1710, Handel had been in Florence to premiere his first opera. Then he goes to Venice and writes this satirical comedy. What Agrippina is, it's a satire of these ancient Roman emperors. And it makes the emperors look, it's very cynical. It's satire. So with this satire, Handel earns international fame and establishes his reputation as an up-and-comer. So Agrippina is the opera that cements his reputation in, well, Italy and Germany. But as I said, what starts in Italy does not stay, or Germany, yikes. What starts in Germany does not stay in Germany. So the Elector of Hanover, Georg Louis, is the great-grandson of James I of England and Scotland. So he's the great-grandson of the guy who started the Stuart dynasty. Then that glorious revolution happens where William and Mary of Orange take over the throne. But after William and Mary are gone, Mary's sister, Queen Anne, is the last Stuart monarch, and she fizzles out, wasn't very popular. She fizzles out without an heir. Because of the levels of intermarriage among English and German rulers, Georg Louis happens to be the closest cousin who can take over that line. So Georg Louis, Elector of Hanover, comes to be George I of England, and the House of Stuart is out, House of Hanover is in. Good, yes. So as George I is bringing all of this German culture to England, he is commissioning operas from Handel throughout this whole period. So the first one we see is Rinaldo in 1711. So that is immediately prior to George's ascent in England. This immediately predates George I's ascent to the throne. And when George brings it to England, it is a huge success. It was the first Italian opera commissioned for performance in England. So there were imported operas in England to some extent before this, but they didn't make much of a splash. In this instance, this is the first time we have a composer being paid specifically to bring over an opera. This is the first time the English are saying, we want an Italian opera of our own. They're not importing an opera that already existed. They're not just reviving or restaging something that had already gone ahead. They, in England, are now, for the very first time, paying for their own opera. And despite Handel's youth at this point, the English immediately declared it a masterpiece. They're like, okay, this guy is the guy. So if Agrippina cemented Handel's Handel's reputation in Germany, Ronaldo cements his relationship, or, oh my goodness, cements his reputation in England. He was hired because of Ronaldo as the orchestra master at the Royal Academy of Music. And the Royal Academy of Music, which in some form still exists, by the way, was the first Italian opera company in England. So Ronaldo is the first opera to be commissioned in England. And it's the impetus for this larger project, the Royal Academy of Music. We have an individual opera that sets off a spark so that a whole opera company gets established. Does that make sense to everybody? Like, here's the opera, but here's the company that grew from it. Thumbs or hands? Okay. Okay. Can I get thumbs to see how many people are in the room? I just want to make sure that people aren't misunderstanding. Can I get thumbs if you're in the room? Okay, good. So I see a lot of thumbs for people in the room, but I see fewer thumbs for people who feel good about this distinction. So basically what's going on here is that George I comes over as king. Handel comes with him because George I is paying Handel to specifically write works for the English stage. No composer before had been hired to write something specifically for the English, at least as an opera seria for the English stage, because we had Purcell, right? Remember, we had Purcell doing his stuff, and we had theater masks in England. But this is the first Italian opera that was commissioned for the English stage. So because George I is paying Handel to do this, they bring Ronaldo. Handel, comes up with Ronaldo, and this starts a larger trend. And eventually they established the Royal Academy of Music, which is an opera company, much like the Metropolitan Opera or the San Francisco Opera or the Wiener Staatsoper. Okay, can I get thumbs or hands now if you feel okay about that trajectory? So Handel specifically worked for the opera. Yes, Perla. He's hired by George I. He's commissioned. So George I gives him a contract saying, I want you to write this thing. And Handel does that for George I. And then it was so popular that they decide to finance this larger project, which is the Royal Academy of Music. Everyone feel good? Okay, I saw a lot of thumbs. Perla, does that feel okay? Good. Oh wait. Okay. So that's the impetus. That's the word I'm looking for. Inception. So let's talk about the Da Capo aria in detail. We've already done this to some extent, but I want to, now that Handel is going to, employ it so consistently, I want to really delve into Handel's version of this. So the Da Capo aria is specifically associated with opera seria. And I mean opera seria in distinction to what other kind of opera was there. We have opera seria and opera.
I don't remember what the actual term is called, but it's like comedy opera. It's the opposite.
Opera buffa.
Precisely. There we go. Opera buffa. If you're ever at a loss for the term, remember buffoon, which is a clown. So it's supposed to make you laugh. Buffa, buffone, good clown. So opera buffa is that comic opera. Now, opera buffa did not use Da Capo arias. Opera seria did. Opera seria was the more prestigious form of opera. It was the form that most composers aspired to. So this is like the big daddy of the whole, yeah, I want to write those kinds of arias. And what distinguishes da capo arias, just like we said a little bit ago, is this ternary form. A section and B section are sections of contrasting thoughts or emotion. Remember, this is coming out of the age of affect. So even though we are now in the age of reason, this is a relic of the age of affect in the earlier Baroque decades. So it's all about contrasting one feeling in the A section with another feeling in the B section. Then at the end of that B section, the composer just writes da capo, so we go back to the A. The second time through the A section, remember, the singer has to give it their all, and they get to invent and improvise embellishments to hold interest. In music, you are never allowed to just repeat something. Even today, we frown on that, right? It gets boring if you just do the same thing over and over again. You are supposed to distinguish a repeat from the original. That is what the performers of da capo arias had to do. How would they distinguish it? By embellishing, by showing off. They would put the fireworks in the second time around. They would do all these virtuosic melismas. Remember I said Domenico Scarlatti inspired Handel to put demands on his performers that he wouldn't otherwise have been inspired to put on them. Well, here's where those demands come in, specifically in the repeat of the A section. Now, let's talk about what's good about this form and what is a weakness of this form. Why might a da capo aria be useful? And that's not a rhetorical question. I'm honestly asking, like, what might a da capo aria contribute to the drama?
Like repetition of an emotional idea, but like with greater intensity.
Good, good. So you're intensifying whatever the performer and the audience feels. You're advancing. Good. What else might it contribute? Able to add a new concept. Yeah, you're showing the complexity of the character's thoughts, right? Like the character isn't just thinking one thing and moving on. They're musing on it. There's a depth to this, a profundity that they're holding on to. Or like to stylist choice. Pearl, you mean like that we would associate the character with a specific stylistic choice?
No, like I'm saying, like maybe like whenever they first did it, like they did it like one way, and then whenever they went back, they did it like maybe more like softer and more louder, or like interpreted it differently, kind of.
That's precisely what would happen. Yeah, whenever they'd go back and repeat, they had to make those choices. And this would be improvised, so they're making those choices in the moment. Yeah, precisely. So good. So Mark said that we are advancing the intensity. Perla says that we are showing a depth and complexity of thought. Any other advantages that we might have with the da capo aria? Okay.
Would it be like easier to memorize because you're going, repeating the sections?
That is 100% true. I'm sure the singers really appreciated this because, even though it's demanding virtuosity in that repeat, it does cut down on what you have to memorize. Quite frankly, as a clarinetist, y'all singers amaze me because I'm still dating my documents 2020. The fact that you guys can memorize 3.5 hours of text in a foreign language, bravi tutti. So I'm sure the singers are very grateful when they encounter the da capo form. what might be the drawbacks of a da capo aria? Or are there any?
Just for the same reasons, like an audience might get bored at the repeat. I couldn't really see that happening, but potentially.
Oh, it is a very real possibility, which is what they're fighting against with all that embellishment. But as we saw in the Rococo keyboard music, embellishment doesn't always sustain interest. So yeah, boredom is a real possibility. Make it longer, people may not be amused anymore. Right. Yeah, exactly. Hey, Mozart is the worst. Sorry, I'm just picturing Ben Schwartz commenting on Mozart as the worst. But yeah, that's the big complaint. Remember, if we looked back to Vivaldi, that was the big complaint about Vivaldi and Concerto Grosso form, is that every time we have that ritornello, we're repeating, and it does add strain on the musicians who have to keep this going ad infinitum. How about in terms of drama, the fact that the singer ends in the same place they started? Have they grown, or has the plot advanced? Has the action, have we moved ahead in any way? I mean, debatable, right? That's one thing to watch out for in a da capo aria, is that, you know, if you're trying to tell a story, but your characters keep ending where they started, it's hard to keep going, right? It's hard to move on if the form demands that you stop in the same place you started, in the same boat. Yeah, that is a very real danger. I'm making this sound so dramatic, but it's opera, so we can be. That is a very real danger that composers of da capo arias face, is like, how could we possibly make this sound authentic? How can we possibly keep going from one thing to another when my characters are stuck in this loop? Okay. Any other drawbacks we might want to watch out for? Okay, great. Thank you guys for really putting on your critical thinking caps. I appreciate that. So the final thing I'll say about da capo aria form before we move on is that each of these sections, ABA, is separated by an instrumental ritornello. Remember from our discussion of Concerto Grosso form, ritornello is a section that it comes back and it's the same, right? It's that refrain that keeps popping up. So each of these sections is separated by some kind of repeating music. Comes down to musicianship. Yeah, absolutely, Alexis. And that's why Joyce DiDonato, that's why I adore her, is because she is so intensely unified with her character that you can feel her development of thoughts and feelings even in da capo arias. Yeah, it's really, for those of you who are performance majors as opposed to education majors, for those of you who are performance majors, take note, because the decisions that you make affect how effective your performance is. And that's why we study music history, right? That's why we have to look back at this stuff, so we, learn the importance of these things. Good. So just like in Concerto Grosso form, we have that ritornello between every episode. In da capo arias, we have instrumental ritornellos separating A, B, A. Okay. Does everyone feel comfortable with the da capo aria form? Can I get a thumb or a hand? Okay. So like if I would ask potentially on a final, describe da capo aria form and what it was used for, you guys would be totally cool with that. Okay, good, good. So now let's look specifically at Handel's career. So as I mentioned before, he starts working at the King's Theatre in London. And he's, getting these commissions from George I himself. This is very much associated with the royal court. And because of the success of those commissions, they established the Royal Academy of Music. In 1729, they have to establish the new Royal Academy of Music because the original one goes bankrupt, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. So let's take it from the beginning. Under the monarch's patronage, prior to George I, masks were the more popular form of entertainment, not operas. Remember, when we looked at Purcell, we said he spent most of his career composing masks. Operas were the anomaly in England. But there was this group of English nobles surrounding George I who wanted Italian opera to flourish, specifically opera seria. But this group of nobles that was under George I's influence, they all ascribed to this cultural agenda of bringing Italian opera seria to the English stage. So they formed a joint stock company. Can anyone think back to like high school econ or heck, even high school social studies? What is a joint stock company? Anybody remember?
So if I remember correctly, it's when like a couple of people like shared some money to invest in like a venture or something, and like weren't there like some like early colonies in America from England that were owned by joint stock companies? Like
Precisely.
um actually never mind, I can't remember any like which ones were, but
A lot of them were the Virginia Company with John Smith, kidnapped Pocahontas, all that fun stuff. The Virginia Company was a joint stock company. I think of what else. Oh, Raleigh, the Roanoke colony, and Raleigh, the joint stock companies. Yeah, most of those early colonists were part of joint stock companies because most of them came to America, not necessarily in search of higher goals, but in search of gold. So yeah, and what it is, it's a pool of investors who all put together their money and they're like, okay, well, we are going to invest in this, as Mark said, venture, whatever business idea they have. We're going to pool all of our money to make it happen, and then we'll split the profits. So that's exactly what these nobles planned on happening here. All of these nobles pooled their money to create the Royal Academy of Music. And they hired Handel as the resident composer, orchestra master, and impresario. Remember, the impresario is the person who takes care of all the business stuff, hiring, firing, planning the season, scheduling the works, renting venues, blah, blah, blah. All of that stuff that's not even musical that Handel has to see to make the Royal Opera, the Royal Academy of Music function. Now, there were financial problems caused by the fact that Handel demanded the best singers from the European continent. So he brought over these rock stars like Farinelli and Senesino. He brought over these rock stars that cost way more money than they were bringing in. So the original Royal Academy of Music had to disband, and less than a year later, we have the new Royal Academy of Music in 1729. And this new Royal Academy of Music had more crown support. So basically the king says, fine, I'll give you more money this time so you don't screw it up. And at this point, more nobles wanted in on the game. That original group of nobles was, just a small group, and now more nobles are getting attracted to this project. So there is a rival opera company called the Opera of the Nobility. You don't have to know about the Opera of the Nobility, just know that Handel was the one serving the king. And after a few years, the new Royal Academy of Music went to, you guessed it, Covent Garden. So the Royal Opera House that we have today is a descendant of this Royal Academy of Music. So this is still very much with us. Okay. Let's look at some of the operas that Handel composed for this company. So, of course, the first one that I already mentioned was Rinaldo. That's the one that really cements Handel's reputation in England. And this is based on, like, it's a story about a crusader. So it's this historic grand epic. His next one, just a year later, is Il Pastor Fido. Does anybody remember what Il Pastor Fido was? We talked about this specifically with madrigal cycles.
I mean, it looks like it means like the faithful shepherd or something.
It does indeed mean the faithful shepherd. What this was a long, multi-part epic poem by Torquato Tasso. And that was the poem that was most commonly set to madrigal cycles. Madrigal cycles being one of those earlier antecedents of opera, when they would publish whole books of madrigals that told the story from beginning to end. So Il Pastor Fido, as source material, was already prominent in madrigal cycles. And Handel, a couple hundred years later, just to show you how important this work is, we're dealing with something a couple hundred years after its inception. And Handel goes back to this same poem and now doesn't set it as a madrigal cycle, he actually turns it into an opera. So again, Handel's looking back for material. Then comes the really important trilogy that if Rinaldo cemented Handel's reputation in his own time and place, this trilogy of 3 operas is what puts him in the historic canon. These 3 operas are mainly what survive to us today. If you're going to hear a Handel opera today, it is probably one of these 3. Giulio Cesare, Julius Caesar, that's who Giulio Cesare is, Tamerlano, Tamerlane, or Rodelinda. So this trilogy puts Handel not only famous in his own time and place, this puts him in the historic canon. This is what defines his place in history. Now, in 1726, so again, the Royal Academy of Music is doing its thing. In 1726, Handel makes the move to England permanent. He says, that's fine. I will no longer be based in Germany. I will no longer work in Germany. I'm going to live and work in England for realsies now. And in 1727, Handel becomes a naturalized British citizen. He also, shortly after that, in 1730, becomes a gentleman of the Chapel Royal. Remember, we talked about that Chapel Royal as earlier as the Tudor period, when we were looking at William Byrd, Thomas Tallis, Thomas Morley, Thomas Weelkes. Was everyone named Thomas then? It's kind of ridiculous. But all of those English composers from centuries before were part of this illustrious Chapel Royal. That, again, patronage of the king but now that they're focused on sacred music. So once Handel becomes an English citizen, he becomes a gentleman of the Chapel Royal, and he's firmly entrenched in George I's court. Now, let's hear some of this opera music. The piece that I asked you to listen to for today was an aria from Giulio Cesare, Julius Caesar in Egypt. Does anybody know the historical story of Caesar in Egypt? I'm not even talking about Handel's specific setting. I'm just talking like, does anybody know about what happened with Julius Caesar in Egypt?
Didn't he get with Cleopatra? Or was that something else?
No, that is a huge part of it.
Okay.
Okay, so that is probably, if you've seen the Rex Harrison and Liz Taylor movie, then yeah, you've definitely got the Caesar and Cleopatra romance down. What happens is Caesar starts fighting with another general, Pompey, and the provinces that Pompey was in charge of happened to be near Egypt. So Pompey allies himself with Ptolemy, the Egyptian pharaoh, and drama happens. Ptolemy and Pompey fight. So Julius Caesar comes over and does his thing. Well, long story short, Ptolemy has Pompey killed. Julius Caesar, who was fighting with Pompey, actually becomes enraged because he didn't want Pompey killed. Caesar wanted to be like the benevolent dictator. And so Caesar and Ptolemy start off on this wrong foot. And Ptolemy's sister slash wife, I did not misspeak, Ptolemy's sister slash wife Cleopatra falls in love with Caesar. And that's that romance. So bad blood between Ptolemy and Caesar, romance between Cleopatra and Caesar. What we are seeing in this aria is the inception of that bad blood. So this is the aria where Caesar finds out Ptolemy has killed Pompey, and he's furious. So this is what we call a rage aria for obvious reasons, because the singer is feeling rage. And what I want you to pay attention to as we listen is, how does Handel communicate that rage? Handel also makes this a very disorienting aria for a couple reasons. First of all, he never gives us the full ritornello after the first time. He gives us half of a ritornello, and even that half doesn't start at the beginning, it starts halfway through. So even when we are expecting part of the music to come back recognizably, even when we are expecting to recognize something, Handel does not give us that. He dangles the carrot. Wait a minute, I should know what's coming. Oh, no, I don't know. This is something I wasn't expecting. It's also disorienting because Handel makes disproportionate sections. So the A section kind of goes on and on for a bit. Caesar is just spitting out, rah, 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 I'm angry, rah, rah. The B section is like teeny tiny. It's just a phrase. And then we're back to the A section. Also, the B section is still pretty ragey. Remember when we were talking about the capo aria form just a bit ago, I said A section should contrast with B section. This really doesn't. It's just angry, angry, angry the whole way through. But what Handel does really well, and why he's so effective at communicating all of this, is this tight unity of singer and orchestra. So in say opera buffa, what we would see is the orchestra taking a more accompanimental role. The orchestra is just underneath the singer. They're in the back seat. They're not our focus. With Handel and opera seria in general, we see a much tighter unity of singer and orchestra. They are not, one is not dominating the other. They're not at cross purposes. Singer and orchestra are working together to communicate the drama. So I'm going to play a little bit of Empio dirò tu sei, evil I say you are. And the question that I want you to meditate on as we are listening to this is, how does Handel communicate this rage? What specifically about this music says rage? Okay, here we go. Here's Empio dirò tu sei. Oh, no, wait, sorry. That was Israel and Egypt. Okay, so notice we've made it through our A section. Here's our B section we're transitioning into. Okay, so we've heard the A and the B. How does Handel communicate rage there? Constant run. Yes, absolutely, Andres. That perpetual motion, and it's a fast motion, right? Just that tempo alone is blistering. Absolutely.
I think that the embellishments in the voice kind of makes it sound like her voice is like shaking, like she's angry. It kind of indicates that.
Absolutely. We have those melismas, right? But even on the shorter embellishments, as Autumn says, like, it feels like the singer is trying to hold something back. And remember, this would have been performed, today it's performed by a woman, or we could have a countertenor in the role, but this would have been performed by a castrato in Handel's time. That's what Farinelli and Senesino, they were castrati. And why does that matter? Well, because castrati were known for their growth hormones were obviously out of whack. So they were known for growing really big, and their rib cages, their lungs, were huge. So castrati were known for being able to maintain these long lines propelled by infinite air in there. So yeah, can you imagine an original castrato doing that and their voice just bursting forth? And yeah, Alexis points out it's low in the voice. Oh, I love this. Yes. That's an excellent detail, that the tessitura it sits in is, it feels like something lower down. It is something lower down because it's in a lower tessitura. And then it just, when she hits those melismas, it just, I can't do it. Again, I don't have a technical word for, but when she hits those melismas, that's when she moves up in the voice, and that's when it gushes out. Anything else we should note? Okay, let's keep going. Again, guys, thanks for really thinking deeply about that. I appreciate your insights. Okay, so that's Giulio Cesare in Egypt. But then Handel's opera career comes crashing to a bit of a halt because of ballad operas. Remember, we talked about ballad operas before. I gave you the example of the Beggar's Opera, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in just a second. But ballad operas are those spoken plays with pop songs interjected. Those are pre-existing songs that the audience knew and could, hum along, clap along, tap their feet, blah, blah, blah. So the songs were already famous, and these ballad operas just kind of compiled them to tell a story. It's like these modern day jukebox musicals that we see on Broadway. But Handel he refused to do ballad opera. Handel championed Italian opera seria throughout his career. So not only was he invested as an artist, he was invested as a businessman. Remember, he was the impresario of the Royal Academy of Music. So he's trying to make this business model work, struggling, but ballad operas are taking over, and that can't be denied. So in 1728, notice this is right before the original Royal Academy of Music goes bankrupt. Remember, in 1729, we have the new Royal Academy. But in 1728, we see John Gay's The Beggar's Opera. And it was the ballad opera, the exemplary ballad opera. It was scandalous, but popular. It's all about this like seamy underworld society revolving around this professional thief, Mac the Knife, who secretly marries his boss thief's daughter while romancing his corrupt jailer's daughter. And in the end, everyone's ready to hang him. But the narrator steps in. No, notice it's not a deus ex machina this time. It's just a narrator making fun and saying, the audience needs a happy ending. So instead of having a hanging, let's have a wedding party. So it's completely lampooning all of those operatic conventions that Handel was advocating. It's just tearing down and biting into opera seria. And these ballad operas are hugely appealing to all classes. The aristocrats get to laugh at the commoners get to laugh at the aristocrats. So they're kind of laughing at cross purposes, but the point being, everybody loves this stuff, and it kind of overcomes Handel's career. So Handel moves away from the opera world and switches to oratorio. We've talked about oratorios before. Remember, these are unstaged dramatic works. So they're using the same type of music. They're using recits and arias. They're using the same orchestration. They're using the same aria form. So you'll hear da capo arias in oratorios, but these are not acted out. The people aren't wearing costumes. They're not walking around on the stage. It's just like seeing the concert version of something. And the reason that these works come about is that during what we call the penitential seasons, so Lent and Advent, the theaters were closed. Theater, like civic law said that theaters had to be closed during these penitential seasons because you sinners are supposed to be concentrating on repentance and reformation, and you shouldn't be gallivanting around to the theater. So to get around the fact that these theaters were closed, composers would set stories, biblical stories, usually from what we call the Old Testament in the Christian tradition, or the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures in the Jewish tradition. So these are the stories usually prior to the life of Jesus. And they're mostly, again, performed during these penitential seasons as like a way of bringing us morality, as elevating, if you will. So Handel switches to this oratorio genre in response to the rise of ballad operas. And these are meant to give us, like, they're allegorical stories with morals and metaphysical messages. So each oratorio is supposed to be teaching us something. So one of Handel's earliest examples is Saul from 1738. So this is not the same Saul that Heinrich Schütz was writing about in Saul, was verfolgst du mich? This is not that Saul. This is Saul of the Old Testament. He was the first king of Israel. And what makes Saul the oratorio really notable is its instrumentation. Handel is extremely sensitive to using the orchestra to communicate the storyline. King Saul who tried to kill David, exactly, that's this Saul. Because David was a threat to him. And in fact, that's a huge part of this oratorio, is the conflict between Saul and his eventual successor, David. Right, Saul perceived David as a threat because Saul angered God, and God said, well, fine, since I am angry at you, you're not going to be king anymore, David's going to be king, and that sets off this conflict. So exactly, Jake. But Handel is amazingly sensitive and amazingly adept at using the orchestra to communicate the story. So we hear the keyboard replicating the chimes, and these chimes come in every time Saul's madness takes over. Every time people are talking about Saul's madness, we hear these chimes. The bassoons come in every time Saul's ghost is on stage. The lyre represents, so the thing about David is that he played the harp, right? He was known for playing the harp out in the field because he started out as a shepherd boy. So Handel uses the lute as David's harp. We also hear, every time battle takes place, this blaring brass. So Handel's incorporating that military band instrumentation into an oratorio. So Saul really represents an advancement in Handel's use of the orchestra. But hey, come on, cooperate. There we go. But of course, that is not all Handel does. We also have Israel in Egypt from just a few years later. So this tells the story from Exodus, where the Hebrew slaves make their escape from the Egyptian Pharaoh. And what is really cool about Israel and Egypt is this double choir instrumentation. Where have we heard double choirs before? Come on, guys, stick with me. I know we've only got 13 people left, but hang out with me just for a little bit more. Where have we heard double choirs before?
Was it in that other opera thing called Saul?
Okay. Let's trace it. Yes. So in Schutz's Zau, was verfolgst du mich, we had that motetto concertato instrumentation. And that motetto concertato comes from St. Mark's in Venice, that Venetian school, right? So that double choir instrumentation has come down to us through a century or so. And now Handel is taking that same instrumentation to England. So Israel and Egypt makes use of that double choir instrumentation. Now, why is this cool? Or I should say, why is this distinct in Israel and Egypt? Because Handel uses incessant choruses. The vast majority of Israel and Egypt is not solo work. The soloists don't tell the story here. Israel and Egypt is really choir after choir after choir. And what makes each choir cool is the word painting. And we're going to talk about this, especially in the plagues, but we're going to talk about Israel and Egypt in just a bit. But before, I want to mention one final opera of Handel's, and that is the one that we actually know him best for, The Messiah. Now, it's weird that we know him best for The Messiah because it's hugely atypical. It is a real anomaly in Handel's oratorio work. Well, why? Because, well, a few reasons actually. It's not one unified text or one unified book of the Bible. This is not one single story. The text of the Messiah is cobbled together from disparate parts of the Bible. It takes verses from, throughout the entire Bible. Also, the Messiah is not narrative. It does not tell a story. It doesn't tell about battles. It doesn't tell about an escape from slavery. It doesn't tell about any heroes or any great deeds. What it does, it's a meditation in 3 sections. The first section, or Act 1, if we want to call it an act, the first section is the birth of Jesus. The second section is his death and resurrection. And the third section is his ascent to glory in heaven with God the Father and God the Holy Spirit. So it's his literal apotheosis. So in each of the 3 sections, we're not telling the story. It's assumed that people know the story. What Handel is doing is providing these musical meditations on a story that we are supposed to have already heard. Another reason that the Messiah is anomalous is it focuses heavily on the New Testament and the arrival of, you guessed it, the Messiah. This is not an Old Testament story like all of his other operas, or oratorio, what am I saying? All of his other oratorios. This is firmly entrenched in the New Testament because it meditates on the arrival of, or on the existence of Jesus. So that is why the Messiah is anomalous. Now, let's go. I know we have 1 minute left, so we're not going to get through all of this, but I want to start thinking about this particular section from Israel in Egypt. So like I said, with Israel and Egypt, there is absolute dominance of the chorus. Notice there is not a soloist taking over in this very, very important section. Rather, the chorus is narrating what is going on. This is also similar to the Messiah. This is a compilation of texts. So we have some texts from the book of Exodus and some text from the book of Psalms. The reason it works the exact same way is because it's compiled by the same scholar, the same collaborator, a guy named Charles Jennens. Jennens compiled these texts for Israel and Egypt, and he compiled the texts for the Messiah. Now, Israel and Egypt supposedly takes place in 2 sections. The first is while the Hebrews are still in slavery. They are decrying their condition to God and praying for release in section 1. Today, we don't really perform that section very often. Today, we only perform the second section, Exodus. So we are focusing on this Exodus idea in this chorus. Anybody have any questions about that before we leave off for the day? Okay, then y'all are free, and happy Monday, if that's not too much of an oxymoron. I will see y'all Wednesday. Thank you, Addison.
I do have a couple questions.
Absolutely.
As far as the Insight projects grading, do you know when those will be up? Or
I am pushing myself to get them out this week.
okay. And then with like the presentations and the Zoom recordings, I didn't know when those would be up either.
Yes, I'm relying on campus Wi-Fi because I cannot afford good Wi-Fi myself. So I need to go to campus to do a mass upload.
Okay. And then with the this current project, for like the, I guess when they write like the 2 or 3 page, what's the word? The part where we have to write like the 2 or 3 paper response kind of thing.
Mhm.
Is it, when you're citing, is it kind of like the MLA format where we just like cite the author?
No, Chicago format, just like it says in the directions, Chicago format.
Well, I know it's kind of like Chicago, but it's more of like, well, it's just like certain author, where it's just like, just put in parentheses like author or,
No, that's not Chicago format. Chicago format uses footnotes.
okay. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, remember it's all in that quick guide that I gave you.
Okay.
Okay, so if you go to that link, it'll tell you exactly how to format it.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.